and contemporary indicators of economic development. I'll then walk you through a number of analyses that explore the robustness of my findings and attempt to give it a causal interpretation. So here's a map of the Indian subcontinent with all of the factory hubs of all of the East India companies geocoded in red. So there are 113 unique factories and trading hubs that I identified based on archival records in India and England and based on a number of secondary sources. They fall into 48 districts in contemporary India. As you'll notice off the cuff that almost all of these, a lot of these trading hubs appear on the coast of the subcontinent. So my empirical analysis is going to be very attuned to the coastal nature of this trade. So what am I going to do? I'm now very interested in studying the implications of this pre-colonial development on contemporary indicators of economic development and growth. My main outcome measures are the proportion of the workforce in farming and agriculture, the fraction of the workforce in industry and manufacturing, the literacy rate, and the infant mortality rates. Now these attempt to capture two things. One is they attempt to capture indicators of growth and development in the context of an economy and society that currently is largely agrarian and largely illiterate. And secondly, they attempt to map very closely onto the transformations that I just described during the pre-colonial era, which is the rapid urbanization of the zones surrounding the factory hubs of the East India companies and the rapid ruralization of the hinterlands, as well as the accumulation of human capital in the East India Company factory hubs. So what I'm first going to do is look to see whether there's a partial correlation between regions that participated in pre-colonial trade and these outcomes that I just discussed. So I have a dummy variable that indicates whether a district had a pre-colonial trading hub during the pre-colonial era. I'm also going to include a number, I don't know whether you can read all of this back there, but I'm going to include a number of control variables. These are pre-treatment controls that capture geography and soil indicators and medieval centers of trade and commerce in India that I coded from atlases and historical sources. So what are my findings? I'm first going to walk you through some partial correlations. The first row is my sample without any controls. It just shows a bivariate relationship between pre-colonial trade and contemporary indicators of development. The first column is the proportion of the workforce in farming, the second is the proportion of the workforce in manufacturing, and the third is the literacy rate. What we see is that there is a negative relationship between pre-colonial trading developments and the proportion of the workforce in agriculture and farming. This relationship switches and becomes positive when we look at more positive indicators of development, such as manufacturing and literacy. The relationship is largely stable when we include all of these pre-treatment controls. It's also qualitatively just the same when we restrict the sample only to coastal districts. So I'm comparing only districts that were on the coast that had or did not have pre-colonial trading hubs. So what this shows is that none of my results are being driven by coastal peculiarities that one might expect or worry about when we looked at the map from earlier. The next thing I have is a number of immediate threats to inference that I want to address. One question is, are my results being driven by these large trading hubs such as Bombay, Calcutta, Madras that did become seats of the British government during colonial rule? But when I exclude these districts from my analyses, my results are qualitatively the same. I'm also concerned whether these results are being driven by developments during the post-colonial period. But my results are not artifacts of these post-colonial developments, because when I look at indicators, outcome indicators from during the colonial period, literacy rates, for example, I find a qualitatively similar set of results. My results are also not being explained by cross-regional variation. When I use fixed effects for both states during the post-colonial period and provinces during the colonial period, my results persist. And finally, my results are very robust to a number of alternate sort of measures of analyses. If you look at covariate specific treatment control comparisons, using a number of matching analyses, I get the similar set of results. And these results are robust to many sets of sensitivities that I would be very happy to talk about during the Q&A. So the next question that I have, and I assume a lot of you might have too, is did these traders go to pre-existing centers of trade that were more likely to develop well over time? So was the actual introduction of pre-colonial trade just sort of a secondary sort of factor in this long-term development trajectory in the subcontinent? Now this of course is a central concern in the literature on colonial institutions, because the colonizers were going to existing centers of sort of trade and commerce during the colonial period. But during the pre-colonial period, this sort of concern might, on the surface, be less relevant to my analyses because Britain was neither the major military power nor the major economic power in the global economy. In fact, when Sir Thomas Roe, the British envoy, visits the port of Surat in 1608, he says that the English factors are in a desperate case, threatened by the Portuguese, plundered by the local officials, and in imminent danger of expulsion. So at least during the pre-colonial era, the historiography suggests that rather than going to existing centers of trade, geopolitical rivalry between the various European traders, between the British, Dutch, French, and Portuguese, both in the Indian subcontinent, but also in other parts of Southeast Asia and throughout the Indian Ocean, guided where these traders were setting up shop and building new factories and trading hubs. Well, it's a rivalry between the traders and local rulers like the Marathas, the Mughals. The Deccan rulers played a big role in determining site selection during this period. So this is what the historiography really focuses on, but I wanted to explore this hypothesis or this claim more robustly. So what do? I go back to the archives in India and in England, and I study original correspondence between the quota directors of the British East India Company in London and their employees or traders on the ground in South Asia. So here's a photo that I took 30 feet high in the stacks of the National Archives of New Delhi to give you a sense of the kinds of source documents I was looking at. But not to give you the wrong impression, the mess was caused before I arrived.
I've been there.
And so what I do is I use this original data, qualitative data, and I triangulate that with many existing sources of historical narratives to study very rigorously the factors guiding site selection. And I'm going to look for evidence to both support and refute four logics, or four hypotheses that might be guiding site selection during the pre-colonial era. So the four logics are as follows. They run the gamut from a moral hypothesis, which is what the literature on colonial institutions has argued, that colonizers were going to morally uplift populations. A second logic is, again from the colonial period, is an extractive logic, that colonizers were going to tax population, extract resources. But as you go towards the pre-colonial era, the logics become slightly different. There's a commercial logic, which is that these traders are going to existing centers of trade to benefit from existing networks. And then there's a geopolitical logic, which is they're really thinking about geopolitical rivalries with other traders and other indigenous rulers in deciding where to set shop. So to give you a quick preview of my evidence, I find that no evidence for a moralizing logic, which makes sense. These were traders. They weren't looking to make a moral mark in the Indian subcontinent. I do find evidence for an extractive logic, but in the opposite direction to what the scholarship on colonial institutions has argued. In fact, traders were themselves worried about getting taxed by local rulers, which made existing centers of trade less appealing for them. Similarly, for a commercial logic, initially traders were going to existing centers of trade. They went to places like Surat and Masulipatam on the western coast. But very soon, these geopolitical concerns made them pivot away from existing centers of trade and move to places such as Bombay and Madras, which they developed by themselves and made into their own centers of trade and commerce. So this qualitative archival evidence then made me think about two other ways in which I could empirically adjudicate the effect of these pre-colonial developments. So the two geospatial features that became very apparent from this geopolitical rivalry logic that seem to influence site selection. The first is the presence of natural harbors. Traders found natural harbors very appealing because these natural harbors protected ships from wind and ocean currents. This is work that Sumitra Jha identifies in his article from 2013 when he looks at medieval trade and continues to be very important during the pre-colonial period in India. The second thing that traders really cared about were mountains surrounding natural harbors. These mountains provided a natural source of defense and protection against attack by other traders and against attack by local rulers. So I have two quotes here. I don't think any of you can read these quotes. It's too small. But the two quotes of here are quotes from historical records which show that these traders found natural harbors and mountains surrounding natural harbors to be especially appealing. So what do? I use geospatial analysis and I go down the coastline of India, identifying every single natural harbor, firstly, and then every single natural harbor surrounded by mountainous topography. So again, it's going to be hard at the end of the room, but this really dark blob that you see over there are the mountains surrounding the port of Mumbai, of Bombay, which was, so you have a natural harbor surrounded by a very mountainous topography, which was, these two quotes will show, was precisely why traders found that port appealing. It was a natural harbor surrounded by mountains, and it could protect the traders by attack from other rulers. So I do this for the entire coastline of India, identifying every single naturally protected natural harbor using geospatial analyses, and I use these geospatial features in two ways. The first thing I do is I restrict my sample only to those districts that have naturally protected natural harbors. So I'm comparing development outcomes only in this really highly favorable set of districts in order to see did places that got pre-colonial trade in this sample end up benefiting over time compared to other districts. And the idea over here is that we know from the historical record that these traders were selecting on this one set of criteria. So if we account for that, if we are able to control for this selection decision, how can we now compare outcomes and how are results? And I find that whether we include controls or not include controls, I have a similar set of qualitative results as my main set of analyses. The second thing I do is I use these naturally protected natural harbors to instrument for site selection during the pre-colonial period. Now the argument over here is that these naturally protected natural harbors were especially appealing during the pre-colonial period, but ceased to be appealing during colonial rule. Once Britain established colonial rule over the subcontinent, it established a protective umbrella over the subcontinent. So during the colonial period, naturally protected natural harbors ceased being less important to development outcomes in the subcontinent. In fact, I have a quote here showing that numerous and countless sources of historiography suggest that during colonial rule, new forms of economic development were taking place in the hinterlands of the subcontinent, along the roads and railways established and being protected by the British. So what I do is that when I instrument for site selection using these naturally protected natural harbors, again I find a similar set of qualitatively similar results. Okay. The next question I have, are there any questions at this point about my analyses?
So the first stage there?
Yeah, I have the first stage in some subsequent slides. So the first stage results are very robust, and these are just the second stage. So
I was just wondering, maybe you're going to say this at the end, but the substantive relationship, not just statistical, how much does it matter and compared to the other things you're comparing yourself?
Yeah, so for instance, when you look at the rate of the proportion of the workforce in farming, there's a 17 percentage point decline in regions that participated in pre-colonial trade. So that's it's a fairly large, the magnitude is very large. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I want to do was adjudicate to what extent do this relationship that I established between the pre-colonial period compare with development during the colonial era. So my approach over here, my empirical approach, is going to rely on a particular feature of British colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. The British ruled over parts of India using what was known as direct rule, where it directly transplanted British administrative structures into the subcontinent, but then allowed about half of the subcontinent, about 45% of British India, to be ruled by what was known as indirect rule, where it allowed native rulers to continue using their own administrative structures in ruling their territories. Now, so there are around 680 native states, 45% of British India, and the literature, the empirical literature on colonialism has argued that directly ruled districts can be associated with colonial institutions because these are direct institutions of the colonizing state, whereas the indirectly ruled regions were not associated with the colonial state. The idea being that native rulers, these were their own states, they had longer time horizons, were able to invest more in their own regions. Now, one sort of empirical and methodological concern we would have is this issue of post-treatment bias. The idea that pre-colonial trading developments likely had some implications in colonial era developments as well. So it's very hard to empirically sort of disentangle the pre-colonial from the colonial period. So I'm going to present two sets of analyses to help get around this. The first thing I'm going to show is using Lakshmi Iyer has a 2010 article in which she uses an instrumental variables analyses to study the effect of colonial institutions, these directly ruled districts, on long-term indicators of growth in the subcontinent. So using her approach, and I can talk about her instrument and the validity during the Q&A, but using her approach, I find no effect of colonial era institutions on my outcome variables. But using my instrumental variables approach that I just discussed a couple of slides ago, I find a very strong effect on these indicators of growth and development.